All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to introduce you to this amazing speaker. She has such an incredible story. And before we even get started, I just want to formally introduce her in terms of where she came from and how we can get all started with her history. So she is an author of a book called On Her Own Ground: The Life and Times of Madame C.J. Walker. This is the New York Times notable book about her entrepreneurial great-great-grandmother and the inspiration of Self-Made, and a fictional Netflix series as well, starring Octavia Spencer. She's also the founder of the Madame Walker Family Archives and brand historian of the Madame Walker by Madame C.J. Walker, a line of hair care products developed in partnership with Sundial Brands and Walmart. She serves on several nonprofit boards, including the Schlesinger Library of the History of Women in America at Harvard's Institute, the March on Washington Film Festival, and the Smithsonian American Women's History Initiative. She's also a former network television executive and producer at ABC News, NBC News, and she is the chair emerita of the National Archives Foundation and the vice chair emerita of Columbia University. Also, Miss Bundles is at work at the Joy Goddess of Harlem, Alelia Walker and Harlem Renaissance, about her great-grandmother whose parties, arts, patronage, and international travels helped define the era. So please help me welcome Miss Alelia Bundles.
Thank you so much for having me. What an exciting conference you're doing.
Yes, and I'm so excited. I have a great relationship with my grandmother, so I adore your story and how, I can't wait to hear more about the story of your great grandmother and what this is all about. So will you please tell us and share with us the inspiration behind, what got you to do what you do today?
So I feel as if I have a couple of different lives, leading a double life, because I write books and do projects related to the history of the women in my family, Madam C.J. Walker, the entrepreneur, and her daughter, Alelia Walker, the patroness of the arts during the Harlem Renaissance. But my other part of my life was my 30-year career as a network television news producer and executive. So these things have been in parallel, though for the last decade and a half, I have been gone from that corporate life and have been developing this other part of me.
Oh, wow. So tell me about how is it in television so different than what you're really doing right now? Because you're basically representing and really being the voice. So tell us about that. Like how is it different? I honestly, I don't feel like there's much of a difference in between what you did and what you're doing now.
Well, that I think you really hit on something, because it feels as if what I did for 30 years was preparing me to do what I'm doing now. So my origin story is I grew up in a household where both of my parents worked in the hair care business. They were both executives. My mother was vice president of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company that had been founded by her great-grandmother in 1906. And that was one of the premier African-American hair care companies. My dad worked for the Walker Company for a couple of years after my parents were married, and then he was hired away to be president of another Black hair care company called Summit Laboratories. So technically my parents were competitors, but not really, because while the Walker Company had been a major player in the hair care space, by the late 1950s and 1960s, it was no longer a major player. And there were other hair care companies that were disrupting the way that women did their hair. So, but both of my parents were involved in the hair care business. I would go with my mother to her office in Indianapolis in this beautiful block-long Flatiron building that's now a National Historic Landmark. But I'd walk into the office with my mom and play on her typewriter and her adding machine before calculators and computers. I would go with her to the factory where the ladies were still mixing the products by hand, and just sort of see her being a businesswoman. But my personal passion was writing. I worked on the school newspaper, and that's what I wanted to be, a journalist. And my parents were very wise about encouraging me to follow my own dreams. So I went to college and worked at the radio station. Then I went to journalism school at Columbia, and then had this 30-year career. But when I was at Columbia, my advisor for my master's paper was a woman named Phyllis Garland, who had worked for Jet and Ebony, whose mother had been the editor of a Black newspaper called the Pittsburgh Courier. And when I met with Phil to talk about the topic for my master's paper, I gave her some cliche topics, as students usually do. And at the end of the conversation, she said, "Your name is Alelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker and Alelia Walker?" And I'm pretty sure Phil knew the answer to that, but that was not what I was talking about, because I wanted to be my own person with my own identity. But I said, "Yes, that's my family." And Phil said, "That's what you're going to write your paper about." And that was the fall of 1975. And while I did my 30-year career in network television news and was learning how to be a good storyteller and learning how to deal with the media from the other side, I was also developing the ability to tell this story. So now it's 4 books later, a Netflix series, Madam by Madam C.J. Walker hair care line, a Barbie doll, a stamp, and all kinds of other projects. So I did what I loved. My parents encouraged me to do that. I was developing my skills and my expertise as a journalist and a storyteller. And now I'm able to use those skills in order to tell the story of an amazing woman who happens to be my great-great-grandmother.
Amazing. Oh my gosh, it's so incredible. That's why when we were looking to select and feature particular speakers, I said, well, wow, what is this all about? I'm like, I have to have Alelia on here because of your story. So what's really interesting is, of course, I have other entrepreneurs from different walks of life. And, some, of course, came from more humble beginnings and having to really work their way up, etc. And of course, they're now have crossed even beyond the 7-figure mark and etc. and is on their way to even, 8 figures. And what's interesting is it looks like you have, it's almost like for simple terms, right? Like on the streets will be, you have it made. You have it made. You grew up in a family where your great grandmother had already businesses and your parents are in business and etc. And I'm sure even so, you still had your challenges. Yes. And so would you share with us what challenges, what type of challenges you had to go through, even in your career, even now, in terms of really overcoming, I guess, obstacles to stay grounded and to continue doing what you're doing? Because no matter where we are from or what kinds of environment that we grew up in or what kind of resources we have, I feel like there are always going to be challenges. So I want to hear from you of what type of challenges you've had in your life, because I wonder if there were any.
Yes, nobody gets out of here without some challenges. Absolutely. And so, Didi, I'm 70 years old. So that means you do not live to be 70 without not having some ups and downs. But yes, I am very fortunate to have had the parents that I had, to have had the encouragement from them. But I also am a woman born in 1952, and the world was very different for women during that period of time. When you think about it, I graduated from college in 1974, and women could not have credit cards in their own name until after the Credit Act was passed a couple of years later. Wow. So then people don't think about that. If you wanted to buy a house or you wanted to have a credit card, it had to be in your husband's name or your father's name. So that was the period of time when I was growing up. When I graduated from college, larger numbers of women were going to medical school, were going to law school. When I came to work at NBC, part of the reason after I graduated from Columbia in 1976, I was hired as a management trainee. But I became a producer. But part of the reason that I was able to walk into that position is because women had sued some of the major magazines and some of the television stations and networks, because young women would be hired as researchers and secretaries, and young men would be hired as desk assistants and associate producers. And 10 years later, the women would still be secretaries and researchers, and the men would be senior producers and executive producers. So I was a recipient of that era of women, of doors opening for women, and affirmative action. Affirmative action is under fire right now, but I have to tell you, I am not the first person in my family who was smart enough to go to Harvard, but I was able to walk through that door. So there are a lot of opportunities came to me during that period of time. There were always some people who, didn't want to give me an opportunity, but I'm really lucky that I had some mentors. So my career was a satisfying career. I had a lot of opportunities. I became deputy bureau chief in Washington, but that happened after I had a boss who was not very nice to me and with whom I didn't get along. So there are always obstacles along the way, but you have to, as you know, and as many of the people who are listening know, you have to be super prepared. You have to have a plan B. And I've always tried to be prepared and to be good at what I do.
That's amazing. Yeah. I think what really resonate with me is being good at what you do. I think oftentimes culturally, I mean, unless you have really been trained and drilled by your parents to work hard, oftentimes it's just do enough just to get by.
That's not good enough.
Yeah, and I truly, that is not good enough, to be honest, these days, because we're in the technology and information age. Anything that we can find is readily available. And you have to really compete in terms of really honing in your craft and really being good at what you do. So that's a great, reminder. And we're so privileged, right? Like we, as women right now, we're so privileged compared to what you shared in terms of not being able to get a credit card back in the days, and not wasn't that many years ago either.
Right.
So no.
And now we just, we take it for granted. I was in the bank today, and there was a young woman in front of me, and she was having a little bit of a disagreement with the bank teller because her bank account apparently it said her name and her husband's name. And the teller said, I can't do this transaction for you because both of you have to sign this. She said, if you had, or I could do that. And I just thought about the ways that women handle money. Now, for me, I've always had my own bank account, but I know that when people are young and they're married and they're trying to, blend their lives together, that there's this desire to have sort of joint bank accounts. But I really am of the belief, if you have a joint account, do it because you're both putting money in to save to buy a house or some big purchase. But I'm a firm believer that women need to have their own credit and their own bank accounts, because you never know what happens, or one person may handle money better than another, but it is important to establish your own credit.
I agree 100%. I mean, for my husband and I, we knew even when we were dating that, yes, we will have a joint for all of the household expenses and everything, but he will have his account and then I would have my account. So yeah, I totally, I mean, because we are still independent people, we're just held together with the marriage, and that's why we can have a joint account, but we don't have to. Yeah. I'm with you definitely, even on that piece because I know what's interesting is I have this question from my younger entrepreneurs all the time of should I put my husband on the business? And I said, well, is he going to be a performing member of the company? Like, what is his role? But if not, no, the company should be under your name, so that way you have full control. So it's a great conversation to help really the women navigate what they should do.
Exactly.
All right, so tell us a little bit about, I guess, how did your great grandmother got into entrepreneurship in the first place? Like, where did it all begin? Like, I want to hear that story.
Well, definitely, it's one of those stories that many women entrepreneurs will identify with. Necessity is the mother of invention. So,
Yes.
Madam Walker was born Sarah Breedlove on a cotton plantation in Delta, Louisiana in 1867, 2 years after the end of the Civil War. It was the same plantation where her parents and older siblings had been enslaved before
Mm.
emancipation. So she grew up very poor, very little education. She was an orphan by the time she was 7. She moved in with her older sister, whose husband abused her. And she said, I got married at 14 to get a home of my own to escape the treatment of my cruel brother-in-law. She had her only child, Lelia, who I'm named after, when she was 17. And when she was 20, her husband, Moses McWilliams, died. So now here is this young woman, a widow at 20, very little education, but she moved up the Mississippi River from Delta, Louisiana to St. Louis, where her older brothers had moved a decade earlier. They were barbers, and they lived very near St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church, a church that has a long reputation for encouraging newcomers to cities and helping people who are in need. And it was those women of the church who began to give Sarah Breedlove a vision of herself as something other than an illiterate washerwoman. And her hair began to fall out. So this was the necessity as the mother of invention. More than a century ago, most Americans didn't have indoor plumbing or electricity. That meant hygiene was very different. People didn't bathe as often. They washed their hair even less. And as a result, she had very horrible scalp infections. She learned something from her brothers, and then she experimented with products that were already on the market. And she came up with an idea to wash your hair more often, and then to apply an ointment that contains sulfur. It was like Vaseline with sulfur. That formula had been around for a long time, though she did briefly work for a woman named Annie Malone, who became her biggest competitor. So she was learning from her brothers, learning from Annie Malone, and then she was a cook for a pharmacist in Denver who helped her tweak her own formula. So now she has this wonderful product. You can see behind me is the picture of the original tin that has her image on it. And she began to sell that, and she knew there was a real market for it. She was living in Denver. She was selling it to women, but Denver has a very small Black population. So she and her third husband, Charles Joseph Walker, began to travel throughout the southwestern and southern United States, settling briefly in Pittsburgh, then in Indianapolis, where they built a factory. So by now she's, making $1,000 a month versus $10 a month, and ultimately becomes a millionaire.
Oh, wow. What a incredible story. So with that said, would you say that is it in history she's the first woman to ever invent African American hair products?
Well, African American hair products have been around since Africa. Women were doing hairstyles, and you see those elaborate hairstyles in Africa. And there actually had been other people who had made hair care products for Black women, and there were a lot of Black women who were the hairdressers for some of their white clients, even during slavery. So it's that she was not the first one to make hair care products, but she came along in a period of time where the cosmetics industry was really burgeoning. So she is a contemporary of Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubinstein. People were downplaying women's cosmetics, only women on the stage wore makeup. Well, but Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubinstein disrupted that. Madam Walker took advantage of this distribution networks. She was very excellent at advertising. She used before and after images. And she also took advantage of the fact that there was beginning to be a migration of African Americans from the rural South to the cities of the North. And those cities became a key market for her.
Oh my goodness. I can sit and listen to these type of stories all day long. Oh my goodness. This reminds me of when I was younger growing up with my grandfather, because he was involved in, all of the World War II and all of the things. So this reminds me of history so much, and so incredible.
Well, and it's how people take advantage of the moment when they see what's going on. And I think for her, because she'd been so poor, she could see herself and other women. So when she traveled around, she would have a meeting. She was very innovative. We have PowerPoint now. She had something called a stereopticon, which was glass slides with projected onto a wall. And she would have a lecture. She'd put an ad in the paper and say, I'm coming, rent out a space in a church. And she'd do a lecture with photographs, not just of her products, but of Black churches and Black schools and colleges. And she would excite the audience in a day before television. Most places didn't have movie theaters. And then she would pull together a smaller group of women, maybe 8 to 10 women, who she thought might be interested in being sales agents. And she'd demonstrate her products. And she would look and see, who is the woman who asks the best questions? Who has some charisma? Who do others gravitate towards? And she would make that person her lead agent. Then she would go on to the next town. Mm-hmm. And I will just say that what I think began to happen for her is that, yes, women wanted her products, they needed her products, but she began to realize that they also needed education and financial independence. And so that became a part of her overall pitch to people, not just use my hair care products, but you can be an independent businesswoman.
Oh my goodness. So fascinating. It's although an older version of the story, but very similar to how we all market ourselves and what we need to be doing. Building relationship is education, is allowing people opportunities that we come across. So this is amazing. This is so aligned with our show because we want to show our audience the possibilities that no matter what walks of life they are from, whether they're more fortunate or less fortunate, it's the willingness to step out and do something that it could help others. And honestly, this is the heart of the show, really, is because it's free and you are contributing your time. Like, you're not being paid for this, it's volunteer time. And this is why it matters. And people need to be really listening in and educating themselves on what they need to do to be better at their craft and believe in possibilities, because we have leaders, women leaders like you and your grandmother and your mom doing, what we need to be following. We have great examples. So with all that said, what's in store? I overheard a doll. So please tell us about that. And how can we get our hands on this doll that you are mentioning about?
Well, we have so many great things that are going on, but a few weeks ago, the Barbie introduced a new Madam Walker Barbie doll as part of their Inspiring Women series. Mm-hmm. And that series includes Sally Ride and Jane Goodall, Ida B. Wells, Maya Angelou, Rosa Parks. So she is in really great company. And it came out on August 24th. And it was sold out in 5 hours on the Mattel site and sold out in less than a week on Amazon, Walmart, and Target. Fortunately, they are going to do a second run, so it will be available before Christmas, and people can go to those websites and sign up. But we're so excited. It's just been, the response has been incredible. And it was very exciting for me because I collaborated with the Barbie design team. Oh. In October of last year, they reached out to me. And of course, Mattel and Barbie are some of the premier brands of the world. And my experience in working with them, it's so clear to me that they are, so good at what they do. Mm-hmm. But they have, the first day there were 35 million media impressions. And I've seen on social media, the Barbie community is really serious and really creative. And then there are, the everyday moms and grandmoms and aunties who are buying this doll for their children.
Oh my goodness. So amazing. Yes, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so the Barbie doll is the, the excitement of the summer. But I'm also working with the hair care products. So Madam by Madam C.J. Walker is a line of hair care products, 11 SKUs, manufactured by Sundial Brands, a division of Unilever. And we launched a new hair care line in January, and they're exclusive in Walmart. But this is a continuation of Madam Walker's original line of hair care products. It's not the original formula, though I do have that formula, but the original formula included petrolatum, like Vaseline, and sulfur. And so we know that those formulas are not really, we want no sulfates in our products. But what was revolutionary in 1906, we want to be revolutionary in 2022. So now we have come up with some new formulas using a century's worth of science and technology.
Oh my goodness, so fascinating to me, and this is so great. And I could sit and talk with you all day, Lilia. But of course, our time is limited, and I really am honored to have you here, part of the show. And I know the audience going to devour your story and hear about how it's truly possible to follow the dreams and work towards it, as long as they have the mission, the vision in mind. And so thank you so much for saying yes and being a part of our show. And thank you for everything that you have done with your career in TV and helping us staying connected to what's going on around the world, etc. And now keeping us all connected with the products, with the Barbie, the doll, and everything else, and doing this for us. I really appreciate it. And on behalf of all of the audience and everyone who's going to be listening to this interview, thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Thank you very much.
Thank you for including me. I appreciate it.